listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and this is the fourth of our partnership with ERNOP, the European Research Network on Philanthropy, where I do some mini interviews with academics whose work has been featured in one of the ERNOP Research Notes series, which is a series that they publish where they get practitioners to summarise recent papers that in the field of philanthropy in academia as a way of trying to kind of bridge that gap between academia and practice. So for this edition of the partnership, I again did 3 interviews. The first is with Pamala Wiepking and Arjen De Wit, both of whom work at Vrije University in the Netherlands, although Pamela's also at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at the University of Indiana, Purdue, as well in the US. And that's a really interesting paper looking at the idea of core funding and trying to sort of put some conceptual framework around the idea that we all sort of broadly, the gut feeling we have in the charity and non-profit world that core funding is a good thing, trying to sort of explain why it is that it's actually a good thing for the organisations that receive it. And then the second interview is with my colleague at the University of Kent, where I teach one day a week, Ali Boddy, and that's a really interesting paper about a project that she has run at Kent, where they get students to take part in a sort of philanthropy project. So they get given some money and they have to go through a process of deciding how to distribute that money. Not necessarily students who are studying philanthropy, as you'll hear, they're in other areas, and that in itself is kind of really interesting. And then the third interview is with Rita Kottasz, who is an academic at Kingston University here in the UK. And I spoke to Rita actually about 2 things. I spoke to her about a paper that she has on disintermediation in the charity and non-profit world, trying to sort of give a typology of what disintermediation actually means. So I spoke to her a little bit about that, but then I probably spoke to her a bit more about another paper that she had looking at who it is that gives to food bank and what the influences are that kind of affect people's willingness to donate to food banks as well. I did that partly because she had sort of 2 papers involved in the research notes, but also the first of those on disintermediation. I'm planning on speaking to one of the other authors, Ian McQuillan, later on this year, so I might go into it in a bit more detail then. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the interviews. So the first one you'll hear will be with Pamala and Arjen, and then I will pop up at intervals just to introduce the other interviewees, and then we'll be back at the end of the episode just for the usual bit of housekeeping. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Pamala Wiepking and Arjen De Wit. Hi to both of you.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Hi there.
Hi there. Well, great to have a chance to talk to you on the podcast. And so, we're here to discuss a research note off the back of a paper that both of you co-authored that's in the most recent release of the ERNOP Research Notes series. And it's all about core funding, which is obviously a topic I'm sure lots of people listening to the podcast will be well aware of, but you've sort of dug into that in a bit more detail and rigor about what it actually means and what the benefits of core funding are for organizations. So it'd be really interesting to kind of hear a bit about that. So Arjen, perhaps you could start just by telling us a bit about what the research is all about, how it came about, and what the sort of key findings from it are.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think the motivation for the project started with the observation that many funders in the philanthropic sector fund projects with requirements on the duration of the grant and the project. The maximum amount of overhead that organizations can spend and things like that. Whereas other funders also try other funding models. Indeed, you mentioned core funding, which is like a model in which you fund core organizational costs. We look at unrestricted funding, which is even more flexible, right? Meaning type of funding that organizations can spend on anything they want, basically. And that's, as got increased attention in the last years, a number of, large American foundations starting to experiment with this type of funding. And the organization that we study in the case study in the paper is the Dutch postcode lottery, which also has been funding organizations with unrestricted funding for years now. So basically, we wanted to kind of develop a theoretical model about what that could do to receiving organizations. We don't have a definite answer yet. So it's like a theoretical model in which we propose different mechanisms that could, in which unrestricted funding could affect different organizational capacities, as we would say. So we often speak of nonprofit capacity. Within the literature, it's suggested that, this is so multidimensional that we should better speak of different nonprofit capacities.
Great. And I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Pamela, in terms of the paper and the findings.
Yeah, it was such a interesting topic to dive into, because both of us are not really, or Arjen is a little bit more an expert on nonprofit finance, but for me, this was a completely new topic. So I typically study donor motivation or global philanthropy, but through this project, which was funded by the Dutch postcode lottery with unrestricted funding. So we ourselves could decide what we wanted to study. And it was so interesting to see how different funders are using different strategies. And I think one of the key things we took away from this project is that as a funder, it's really important to think about whether your funding strategy aligns with your mission or your theory of change. So you may have this really, really big mission or theory of change, but if you're just giving small time project funding, you may not achieve that mission. So that's really the thing that I took away from this project as a suggestion to funders to think more about whether your funding strategy aligns with your theory of change.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a couple of things. I mean, there was loads of stuff in the paper I found really interesting and definitely resonated, I think, with things that I've heard before about the capacity for innovation and the value to organizations, particularly that focus on advocacy. One thing that I was really interested in, and I wondered if it came out of the paper at all, was whether you got a sense of organizations that were receiving unrestricted funding, whether they always spent that funding on things that they couldn't have raised the money for in other ways, or whether actually in some cases they end up almost kind of cannibalizing money that they could have got through restricted funding just because they had more immediate needs. Did you see whether they kind of had a clear demarcation in their minds of thinking, right, this is the stuff that we can only fund through unrestricted funding, so let's use that money for this? Or was it more complicated than that?
I think it really depends on the organization. I'm not sure it's complicated, but it really depends on the capacities that the organization really think they should invest this unrestricted funding in. And one of the things we came across, for example, is that organizations use this unrestricted funding to bridge project funding, because based on the project funding they, for example, get from governments, that doesn't allow for enough overhead costs to cover their core costs. So they needed the unrestricted funding to actually run the projects that were funded, for example, by government. And Arjen, do you also have other examples?
Yeah, I think one specific example of something that organizations mentioned as being something that is difficult to fund otherwise is the lobby, right, towards governments or corporations. And this is kind of a double-edged sword, because it's also the unrestrictedness of it makes also the organization less dependent of what the funder wants. So in terms of like mission orientation, some organizations, for example, in our sample that we interviewed, say like, yeah, I receive also government subsidies, but at the same time we have to be critical of the same government. And if you also have like from another like private source some unrestricted funding, like this organization did, it allows us to be more critical and to also do the lobby. So I think that's also a nice example of what
absolutely
you can do. Yeah.
And it's, certainly, very pertinent. Here in the UK, it's been, I know, a problem the other way, where there's been concerns over the last 5 or 10 years that government contracts for delivering services have had clauses inserted saying specifically you can't use any of this money to subsidize lobbying activities, and you're not actually even allowed to get money from elsewhere to lobby. So I think, it is very much a live issue. One of the other things I wanted to ask as well was whether the sort of focus on impact measurement amongst funders that we've seen, certainly, over the last decade, if not quite a bit more than that, whether that has played a part in making it even more commonplace for restricted funding models to be applied, because people want to be able to measure the impact of their specific funding. Does that kind of drive funders towards restricted rather than unrestricted models?
Yeah, I actually think so. To be a bit more critical, which is, a bit outside of the paper that we wrote, but a bit more personal view, is that I think it is also the imagined impact, right, that funders want to see. I mean, the impact reporting that they ask for, I sometimes wonder, if that's really impact that we are seeing. They do some kind of, surveys among users, and then they say, yeah, we reached so many people and they are satisfied to this extent, which is great. But is that really impact? I mean, there's no like counterfactual or no like real measurement of what the causal effect was of the intervention that you made. So I think all the attention for impact is great, but indeed it leads to this kind of restricted project funds in which there's a lot of reporting, from which you can also question the actual whether it actually measures what it wants to measure.
And I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add on that, Pamela, or whether, I'd be interested in how this crosses over the work you've done on sort of individual donors and their motivations, and whether you've seen anything, similar, or they're kind of, you feel as though institutional funders and individual funders are different when it comes towards their attitudes and practices around unrestricted rather than restricted funding.
Well, I think people remain people, whether they're an institutional funder or whether they're an individual donor or a major donor. So a lot of the motivations remain the same. And I think a lot of funders, including individual donors, have a fear when they're giving large sums of money that this money will not be spent well. And especially if you're on the board of an organization or an advisory board, you feel this responsibility that the money your organization is using to fund other organizations will be spent well in line with your own mission. So this leads to a very restrictive approach where people are just trying to get as much grasp on those gifts as possible. But that can work really counter effective, because those gifts will not be spent most effectively, likely. And there's a lot of talk about and written about all the reporting requirements that, as one of our respondents says, drive me nuts. He said they have to just report everything, and they sometimes have to hire a full-time staff person just to report everything back that they're doing. And that money could be spent on the cause as well, of course. One thing that I really liked when I spoke with a UK CEO of a nonprofit organization, Spacework, recently, Chris Healy, and what he shared was that he used unrestricted funding also to fund projects within the organization, so that he could communicate to the donors giving unrestricted funding exactly where the money went, and in that way actually build on the relationship with the donor. And I think that was a really smart way to use this unrestricted funding, rather than use it for salaries that people don't really care about funding. But even though it's unrestricted funding, match it with a project within the organization, so donors are engaged with the organization and know where their money went.
That's really interesting, because I have heard similarly from organizations that give unrestricted funding that they believe in it and they're happy to do it, but it can be a challenge, because particularly when the organization they're giving to maybe is getting restricted funding and project-based funding, where the impact of that's very clear, and it's often there's a lot of attribution to the funders, whereas the core funding or the unrestricted funders sometimes get a little bit forgotten because their money just dissipates throughout the organization. So that's really interesting. We probably need to move on because it's unfortunately not a full-length episode, but I wanted to ask one other thing about the paper, which was we hear a lot about the benefits of unrestricted funding for recipient organizations, and most organizations I think would say they would be delighted to have entirely unrestricted funding. Did you get any sense of whether there are occasionally actually sort of downsides to restricted funding from the point of view of recipients? Is it sometimes better for them to get restricted funding? Is that ever the case?
I'm so happy you asked that question. I was all the time thinking, we should say something about, we are kind of advocating here unrestricted funding as something very good, but of course there are possible downsides. Indeed, we interviewed for this paper grantees of unrestricted funding, and like you say, of course, they are overall super happy with it. We did observe a few possible downsides. One is that if you receive multi-year unrestricted funding for years, you might become too dependent of that funding stream. You also kind of count on that, that it continues, but that might disappear one day. One other thing that one respondent mentioned is that it is possible that you, within the organization, become less critical about how you spend the money, right? And I think that is something that also funders are afraid of, right? And that is a fear that, that should be addressed. So there should be some kind of accountability, of course, in place, and a relationship between the funder and the grantee. And I think that's crucial in, also pursuing this. Organizations like foundations or other funders that want to experiment with this, so should really be aware of, because I think that is a motivation for many funders to not do it, but can be overcome maybe.
I just want to zoom out now before I let you both go, just to ask kind of this paper. I think it's obviously about an issue where the practical relevance is very clear and practitioners will get a lot out of it. What's your sort of experience and perception of the links between academia and practice more broadly in terms of studying kind of philanthropy? Do you think that works well at the moment? Do you think it's a challenge to engage practitioners, and that there's perhaps a lot more that they could be learning from the academic field? And if so, kind of, what do you think we need to be doing more of?
Yeah, I also love this question. You ask great questions. I think it's not going well, but I don't want to ask the question what practitioners can learn from academics, but I want to ask the question what academics can learn from practitioners, because I think large part of the issue is that academics rarely engage with practice, and because the incentive structure at universities is not very conducive to engaging with practitioners, because you, as an academic, you don't get rewarded for the collaborations with practice. You get rewarded for this one paper that is published in an academic journal that no one reads, or how much funding you're managed to get. So I think that should really change, what is rewarded and appreciated in what academics do. And I think it is really important to involve people from practice. If you study a topic that is so concretely related to practice, like we do, that you involve people from practice in a meaningful way at the start of a project, and not just at the end, but really involve them in designing your research questions, how you're gonna answer these research questions. And that's what we try to do at the Center for Grant-Making Research, but we can certainly continue to improve on that.
And I don't know if you have any thoughts, Arjen, on this sort of practice-academia connection.
No, I mean, I totally agree with Pamala, and I think ERNOP is doing a great job in trying to bring those fields together with the research notes, and also in the conference where practitioners are invited. And this is a great example, I think, and also this podcast actually, of ways to bridge the practice and academia, because sometimes it's also about the language that you speak, right? I also tried to set up a field experiment once with fundraisers, and it was so hard because they just didn't understand what I meant with an experiment, right? We all know the word experiment, but what do you mean with it is for academics is something different maybe than someone who's not into academic research. So I think understanding each other's language is important, and also takes a long time.
Yeah, I think so. And certainly the conversations I've had through this podcast, I mean, it's reassuring that actually there is an appetite to learn about what's going on in academia, and actually a sense that what is being produced in academia is genuinely of interest. It's just that we need to do a lot more to kind of connect the dots between the two. Before I let you both go, the other thing I just wanted to ask, because I'm aware often the work that's done on these papers, given the timescales in academia, which is another challenge, I think, in terms of connection with practice, the work is often a few years kind of in the past. So what is it that you're both working on now? Is there anything that's kind of connected to this paper or building on it, or are there other areas that you're particularly focusing on at the moment?
Yeah, we really want to test this model. So this is a conceptual theoretical model based on our interviews and the existing literature. But now it is really important that we start to really understand how does unrestricted funding really enhances nonprofit capabilities, with specific capabilities, and how does that then lead to nonprofit effectiveness, how effective the organizations are in achieving their mission. So that is a really big task, but we're really excited to keep going with it, and encourage anyone else who's interested in studying this to also dive in, because I think we need to learn much more about how this works to make philanthropy more meaningful and more effective.
And Arjen, I will allow you the final word if you've got. Any follow-up on
This
that?
was the perfect final word. It was a great last statement, I would say.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, my thanks to both of you for finding time to come on the podcast. It's great to hear about it, and I'm only sorry I haven't got time to talk about it more, but perhaps as the work goes along, we can kind of pick it up and discuss in more detail, because I think it's a really fascinating area. But wish you, both the best with all of that future work, and hopefully have another chance to speak soon.
Oh, I'd love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for hosting this.
The next interview that you're going to hear is with Ali Boddy, and that's about her paper, Teaching Student Philanthropy, Possibilities for Practice within the UK Higher Education Sector, which she co-authored with Emily Lau, another colleague of mine. So I hope you enjoy this one. Okay, great. So I'm here with Ali Boddy. Hi there, Ali.
Hi, Audrey. How are you doing?
I'm great, thank you. And as I said in the intro, people might be aware that we are sometimes colleagues at the University of Kent, although, as I was clear to say, they've had no involvement whatsoever in the work that we're here to talk about. The paper that we're discussing and the research note off the back of it is about some really interesting work you've been doing at the University of Kent, a project around getting students to engage with philanthropy through sort of experiential learning. So maybe you could just say a bit about what that project is, what this paper's about, and what the kind of key findings are.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was really based upon observing quite a lot of activity in the US around student philanthropy modules, and these being quite a popular thing, with some really interesting results. And then looking across the higher education sector in the UK and realising that we didn't have anything like this in the UK. And so the paper is just exploring our kind of pilot exploration of delivering this module. It's a module now that we're just about to go into the 4th year of delivery, where the students are essentially become the grant makers. So we work in partnership with our local community foundation to deliver this. And the students have a pot of funding of £2,500 to allocate out to local causes. And what we've done is try to bring in a really kind of reflective evaluation study that runs alongside the module as well. And this paper is basically responding to that, about actually what did we think were the really important parts of the learning and part of the student experience that kind of really make this module stand out as something different. And we really wanted to put it out there as to kind of to share with other universities and other organisations working with young people that they might be able to pick up and do something different.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And looking at the paper, I mean, quite a lot of the similar initiatives that I'm aware of where there's kind of classroom-based philanthropy are in the context of people doing courses that try to teach them about philanthropy. Is that the case here, or is it also something where you were taking people who aren't studying philanthropy and using philanthropy essentially as a kind of learning tool to help them develop other bits of knowledge?
Yes, absolutely. So this module is targeted at undergraduate students who normally come to the first session without any sense of what philanthropy even is, and or come with quite a skepticism of philanthropy as well. And so it's very much kind of focused on both about learning what philanthropy is, but using the philanthropic process as well to learn about the wider community, the voluntary sector, local organisations that are out there working, and also a kind of self-reflection on our own level of citizenship. So whilst I spoke about the US and the US models being quite kind of motivated for this, a lot of my own research focuses on how children and young people are socialised into ideas of giving. So not just the idea of let's get more people donating or more people volunteering, but also let's think pedagogically in terms of, well, how are we framing that? What is it that we're learning through these processes? So we do take quite a critical look at philanthropy, at the voluntary sector, at charity, at the relationship between charity and the state, all as part of this module, but in a very student-led way. So we run 2-hour workshops each week. The students, we never do a lecture, so we're never standing at the front of the class lecturing to our students, but instead we raise critical questions about the topic that we're exploring at that point. And together as a group, we go away and explore, well, what does that look like? So, for example, students might come in with a stereotypical idea that CEOs are paid too much. That might be a kind of typical one. And so we actually go in and we dive into the data and we explore that, and we explore how do charities actually function and where is that funding coming from, and how does that kind of compare to what's happening across the wider kind of social sector. So it really is about sort of trying to unpick a lot of those ideas as well.
Yeah, and do you get a sense that those students come away with a fundamentally different view of what philanthropy is and an opinion about, whether or not they think it's a good thing?
Absolutely. So I think there's two sides to that. I think they have a much better understanding of, we quite often talk about the philanthropic ecosystem. I think when they first walk into the room, their nearest understanding of philanthropy will be something like Bill Gates. And actually we talk about a much wider understanding, and we do use the widest understanding of philanthropy. So they also then walk away with an understanding of themselves as a philanthropist. So we, as I say, we have quite a focus on, well, what is my own engagement in this? What is my own kind of sense of citizenship within these processes, and how can I engage with the philanthropic ecosystem, and sort of what's my own power in that as well. And so I do think we try to make it quite a disruptive learning process on purpose, sort of quite challenging and reflecting on our own ideas. So one of the first sessions that we run, so before we've even introduced the idea of philanthropy, before we even introduce any of the sort of learning, the students have basically 10 charities that they have a kind of framework of, and a fictitious example of, there's £10,000, who are you going to give to and why? And that's such a great exercise to start with, because the students then start thinking, first of all, it starts making them think about their own personal connections to different causes and what it is they're interested in. But also it starts to sort of bring out their own unconscious bias about certain things. So you start getting conversations about, well, what do we consider worthy? What do we consider unworthy? And actually, do we need to unpick that? And do we need to reflect on that? So there's a lot of self-reflection that goes on throughout the module as well, because then obviously the students by the end are having to make that decision in real life. And so we do see quite a kind of a transformational impact on the students. And the students certainly report that back to us.
Yeah, and do you ever find that in those conversations, because it's a kind of collective model of decision making, I'd be kind of interested actually to know how they decide on the sort of specifics of that as well. But I guess the thing that occurred to me, having been in the room when there's been similar processes going on, is that they actually can quite often get relatively heated. It probably in hopefully in a positive way, because it sort of reminds you that fundamentally these are very values driven conversations. Have you seen that in the groups you're working with, and kind of how do you manage that challenge?
Yeah, so it definitely does get quite heated. At the very beginning, we do set out certain ground rules about obviously sort of respecting each other's views, lived experiences, etc. And the students are normally very good at doing that. And you do get some quite challenging lived experiences coming into the room as well. So, for example, last year, one of our students was a refugee currently going through the asylum seeking process and was sharing their experiences of that. And that really kind of opened up the conversation to everyone else in the room, and kind of brought a new kind of realization into what was kind of going on. But overall, I would say the students deal with that kind of discussion and debate in a really ethical and respectful way of one another. And in terms of how we get to that decision making, it's actually the students decide themselves. So we talk about different models, we talk about voting systems, we talk about kind of different ways that we could come to the end decision. But the students go through that deliberation process and decide themselves how they will come to that final decision. So far, it's normally worked on a voting process in terms of that their top choice gets 2 votes, the second choice gets 1 vote, for example. But there's lots of other decisions they have to make along the way. So, for example, £2,500 isn't a huge amount by any means, but sometimes they're deciding whether they're going to split that into 2, whether they're going to give it out as 1 lump sum. And so we start talking about all of those parts of it. So as we go through the module, just to give a kind of quick run through of the structure. So as I say, we work with the Community Foundation, but that's more than anything so they can carry out the due diligence on organisations. So the first decision the students have to decide is what is it they're going to focus on. So they have to think about the size of organisation, maybe geographical focus, the cause focus, and so they put the parameters on that grant. The community foundation then send out a call to organisations saying we have this funding available. We've developed each year. We develop the application form, but we really do make them keep it very, very short, because there's an ethical essence here in terms of you don't want organisations spending a long time having to fill out a form for a very small amount of money. So it's literally 3 very quick questions. The organisations then apply via the Community Foundation. All of those applications come to the students, and the students then make the decision-making process. So at that point, they then have to go through, well, this organisation is only asking for 1,000, whereas this is asking for 2,000. And I suppose the essence has always been that we're having discussions that all the time are good versus good. And actually, the discussion comes down to where can their funding do the most good at this point in time, which in itself brings an interesting kind of focus to the conversation as well for them.
Yeah, I think that's that point you make there about it being choices between good versus good is really interesting, because the thing I've sort of seen in these processes is maybe a slightly greater appreciation of the fact that fundamentally you're always making decisions in philanthropy, and you can't get away from the fact that it's not necessarily there's no necessarily right decision. There's one decision and another decision, and each might be equally valid, but at some point sooner or later you have to kind of own that choice. I was just going to ask as well, because obviously like the focus of these ERNOP research notes is trying to kind of join the dots between academia and practice. It feels like this is a very obviously practice focused piece of work, and the kind of the lessons for practitioners are fairly clear. What's your hope in terms of where this work might go next? Where do you see it having kind of wider application?
So I think it plays a really important part for me in the whole kind of agenda around the civic university, and the role of the civic university, and how we can kind of engender those conversations with students who are, so the students that we're currently working with are studying social policy, but for example, but social policy is always going to be impacted by philanthropy and the voluntary and community sector. And so it's really important that when they leave the university that they have that understanding. So for me, it's about how can we now take these conversations into different spaces. So for example, if you're a medical student, philanthropy still massively impacts what you're going to go out into the world and do, and the opportunities that are available. The same if you work in conservation, if you work in anthropology, all of these different, or psychology, all of these different areas. So for me, this is about us kind of joining up those dots about how multidisciplinary philanthropy is, and the philanthropy is of this kind of area of study that is distinct, whilst I do think it's a distinct area of study, but it impacts every area of our lives. So for example, to bring that as a real kind of concrete thing for the students, we do a life course mapping exercise with the students where we track where their life has been impacted by philanthropy. And so we even go down to kind of, well, what primary school did you go to? Let's look at the background of that primary school. What secondary school did you go to? What sports are you involved in? And so we actually make all of those links from, well, actually, local football clubs wouldn't run without philanthropy. The theatre that you really enjoyed attending wouldn't be here without philanthropy. So we both do a mapping exercise about how their life has been impacted by philanthropy, but where also then they are connected to philanthropy, where they are either volunteering or they're giving, and in ways that they haven't really thought about before. And so we actually want to kind of, and that's why I come back to that idea of citizenship, that our philanthropic citizenship is something that is kind of, it's not something we just do, it's an embodied part of ourselves and our lives and our lived experiences. And I think that starts changing the conversation and students' perceptions as well.
Yeah, it's really, really, really interesting. I think that link between philanthropy and the whole idea of it as a nursery of democracy and kind of active citizenship is so important, but often kind of, as you say, maybe the word philanthropy, it takes a while for people to make the links between that and that idea of kind of citizenship and participation. But really fascinating. I just wanted to ask before I let you go as well, what it is that you're currently working on at the moment. I mean, is it stuff, I certainly know that you've got a book coming out that is linked to this and focusing on kind of children and philanthropy. Maybe you could just say a bit about that and any other kind of work that you've got that you're particularly interested in.
Yes, absolutely. So we're running this module again. I'm not sure when your podcast comes out, but this will be running in the spring term. And so I'm already preparing for my next cohort of students that are coming through on that. So I'm really looking forward to that. We have a big economic Social Research Council grant. Sorry, I just want to remember the acronyms then. That's looking at how so we talk a lot about philanthropic citizenship. So how philanthropic citizenship is taught within primary schools. So we've done a big mapping exercise of primary education, and we're now working in participatory action research programs with children about how they understand their own philanthropic citizenship. And then, yes, as you say, I have a book coming out. I probably think it'll be about summer when it comes out, called Children as Changemakers, Unleashing Children's Real Philanthropic Power. And that very much focuses on that idea of that so much, and I think this doesn't impact the module, so much of what we teach and talk about philanthropy in children and young people's early experiences is framed in an idea of benevolence and individualistic private action. And so this book is sort of focusing that says, actually, what if we shift that narrative? What if we shift the narrative to focusing more on justice-orientated ideas of citizenship, on collective action, collective power, and look at it through a different lens? And I think that's what we try to embody in this module that we're teaching as well. But that book very much talks about it in, well, actually, what if we reframed children's experiences? Instead of teaching them to give to the food bank, say, yes, it's great to give to the food bank, but let's also question why food poverty exists at the same time, and where else we can use our voice and power to challenge some of those ideas.
And yeah, certainly my experience of talking to my own kids is that they're more than capable of understanding those kinds of ideas. And it's really interesting when you do get into them. That's absolutely great. And I should mark your card now that I definitely will be asking you to come back and do a full-length podcast when the book's out, because I'd love to talk about that in detail. But for now, yeah, remains to say just thanks ever so much for coming on. Really interesting to hear about the work. And yeah, certainly look forward to the book when that comes out.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rodri.
Okay, and then the final interview you're going to hear now is with Rita Kottasz from Kingston University. And this, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, is about two papers. So we talked briefly about the paper on disintermediated giving. So that paper is called A Typology of Disintermediated Giving and Asking in the Non-Profit Sector, which Rita co-authored with Ian McQuillan and with Juniper Losalento and Neil Gelliford. And then the other paper that we talk in a little bit more detail about is titled Who Gives to Food Banks? A Study of Influences Affecting Donations to Food Banks by Individuals. And Rita co-authored that with Roger Bennett and Rohini Vijay Gopal. So without further ado, let's go into that one. I hope you enjoy that, and then I'll just be back briefly at the end of the episode. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Rita Kottasz. Hi there, Rita.
Hi, Rodri.
Well, great to have you on the podcast. And yeah, I think we're here to talk in a little bit of detail about two papers that you were involved in, actually, that are both out in this latest release of ERNOP Research Notes. There's one that's about the question of disintermediation and sort of how that plays out in the charity sector and how we can understand it better. So we'll talk about that one a little bit first. And then also a really interesting paper on food banks and the people who donate to them, which we'll dig into a little bit. So maybe you could start by just saying a bit about the disintermediation paper. I think maybe kind of what it's actually about, what you mean by disintermediation, and what the paper focuses on.
Yeah, so thanks very much for inviting me. Yes, I mean, the disintermediation project is actually really very interesting because it started out as a Rogare project. Rogare is a think tank run by Ian McQuillan, and he asked me to participate in the paper. So initially we started out, I think, 5 or 6 people, but it kind of soon became quite evident that everybody had a different idea about what disintermediation means in the charity context. And we had many deliberations, and some people actually dropped out of the project because it was very difficult to kind of unpick what we actually mean by it. And, you know, there's kind of words which, you know, when you look at the disintermediation literature in the for-profit area, you know, it's kind of a bit more clear because there's a process of exchange where you have a customer and an organization, and then the customer may choose to buy or purchase something directly. So, for example, travel agency is a really good way to kind of understand it, that you go and buy and purchase an aeroplane ticket and a hotel without the use of the travel agent. So obviously in the non-profit context, that's really very different, because you've got the donor, you've got the charity, and you've got the beneficiary. So we're looking at allocation of resources, but also the acquisition of resources, but there's kind of no kind of exchange, from the in the same way that you would have with the travel agency. So we were kind of throwing up lots of different ideas, and words came up, things like disruption. Is it disruption? Is it disintermediation? Is it replacement? Is it displacement? Is it bypassing certain areas of giving? And of course, then we had difficulties kind of defining, what is charity? Because we've got the legal status of different entities, which can all kind of be categorized as charities. But then we decided that we actually are focusing on the traditional giving and receiving within, kind of traditional charitable organizations like Oxfam or an SPCC, rather than looking at schools or kind of local government type organizations, or even social enterprises, which might be set up as a charity. So once we've kind of got to grips with what we're understanding by it, and I think, and I've got it down here, that we kind of try to understand disintermediation in relation to the kind of supply chain, in inverted commas, steps in the supply chain, and then the elimination of particular functions and processes. So we really try to focus on the functions and the processes, rather than the idea which some of our colleagues who initially started out with us, they wanted to focus specifically on this donor relationship and the direct giving between a donor and a beneficiary, which in the real sense, if you think about it, that's kind of the cleanest, most black and white way of looking at disintermediation. So example is crowdfunding. So I could set up a campaign where I am funding you, Rodri, for your medical expenses on a site such as GoFundMe. So I'm giving the money directly to you to pay for your medical expenses. So that's probably the cleanest way to understand disintermediation between the donor, the charity, and the beneficiary. But as I said, it's quite complicated when you actually get to the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that comes out in the paper. And as you say, I mean, haven't really got the time to dig into it in detail here, but I will put links in the show notes to places where people can find both the research note and the paper. And I'd recommend reading it, because it's a fascinating topic, and certainly something I plan to, I've done bits of work on before, and I plan to come back to hopefully in more detail on the podcast. And just the one thing I think in what you're saying there's pick up on is, even when we talk about disintermediation, as you note in the paper, often actually what's happening is not genuine disintermediation. It's just the nature of the intermediary is changing because you're using a platform rather than a charity, but there's still intermediation, and it's what are then the roles and responsibilities of that intermediary. So I think that there are all kinds of fascinating questions. I just wanted to move on so that we've got a bit of time to talk about the food bank question, although I think there are actually some interesting links there, which maybe we'll touch on as well. And maybe you could just say a bit about what this piece of research was, because I'm sure people are were already aware of food banks, but obviously I think during the pandemic, they became very much more a part of people's lives and the public consciousness. And there's some really interesting stuff in this paper looking at kind of the people who donate to food banks and what drives that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, because actually this project started before the pandemic, actually, because the data was collected mostly in 2019. But we were just aware that there was a lot of research on understanding who the beneficiaries are of food banks. And that's kind of interesting in the kind of Western perspective nowadays, because many people don't realize that in wealthy countries like the UK, there's a big increase in food bank use, and people don't realize that there's a lot of people in poverty in wealthy countries. So the literature suggested that we understand who the beneficiaries are quite well, and we also many academics have looked at the kind of socio-political kind of reasons and consequences of the use of food banks, but there was hardly any studies. I think we found one in the US that was published in 2003 that looked at focus groups looking at how donors perceived the beneficiaries of these food banks. But that study was very much focused on kind of white middle class, kind of regular donors, religious donors, which is kind of the typical donor profile of giving in general. So we just wanted to kind of, I think, add to the literature to try and see how people actually perceived the food bank beneficiaries and who these people were, what kind of social demographic background they were from. Now, it was quite a kind of a quick and dirty study, I would say, because it's a relatively small sample, and the data was collected in and around Kingston upon Thames, which is a kind of a wealthy area. But we tried to kind of differentiate between the poorer areas of Kingston upon Thames, which would kind of, be kind of parts within Chessington, and then kind of collecting data also from people leaving supermarkets in wealthier parts in Surbiton and Kingston. We actually found that possibly because it's not a great variation, so we should have maybe gone to kind of properly deprived areas in and around London to get a better feel for what's going on. We found that the people shopping in Chessington and Kingston and Surbiton are actually pretty similar in many instances in terms of their socioeconomic profile. Yes, so one interesting thing from the interviews coming from the people that we interviewed was the difference in perception of how they perceived food bank beneficiaries, and especially in relation to people who gave to the food bank and the people who decided not to give to the food bank. So we tried to kind of get a relatively equal sample of people who were donating to the food bank. So we asked them straight after they came out of the supermarket, had you given to the food bank basket that was available at the checkout? And so we, I think, roughly got about 300 individuals from each of those groups. And what was interesting, we kind of asked them kind of open-endedly about how do you perceive people that receive these donations? And the people who donated tended to be more positive about the way they felt about these beneficiaries, that they were kind of almost kind of victims of an unfair society, that they were deserving people, those sorts of kind of words kind of propped up. But the people who didn't give were either kind of apathetic and didn't even probably really notice that there was a food bank like a point, or they would kind of have disparaging comments to say about the beneficiaries, whether, that they were maybe not deserving, lazy, or not able to manage their money, and therefore they should be looking to kind of budget better, etc., etc. But of course, we know that, especially during the pandemic, after the study was conducted, that there were people who wouldn't normally be using food banks, like healthcare workers, single mothers with children, and maybe groups that wouldn't normally be associated with kind of charity beneficiaries.
Yeah, I absolutely fascinating stuff, I think, in there on those things around motivations. I mean, reading it, it struck me that those kind of deep currents of distinguishing between sort of deserving and undeserving poor that have always been there throughout charity, it gave a sense that that's very much kind of alive and well. And that was somewhere where it struck me there was potentially a crossover with the disintermediation work, because I know one of the things that's said about crowdfunding is, the danger that you see is that actually you get more of that, because the more that you take charities out of the picture and they're not able to smooth those effects and make sure that resources are allocated, then individuals do bring those biases in terms of who they decide to give to. So I thought that was fascinating. And one thing I wanted to ask actually is kind of that it seems intuitive that people who hold a relatively negative view of poverty as a sort of moral failing of the individual might justify not giving to food banks on that side. But almost at the other end of the spectrum, did you get any sense that there were people who kind of viewed poverty as a structural problem, but almost were reluctant to give to a food bank because that's a kind of symptomatic way of addressing it? Because we do hear that sometimes, that people kind of think it's the government's fault, but they don't want to support a food bank because that's almost not addressing the problem or letting the government off the hook.
Yeah, so kind of interestingly, what we found in the data was that I think probably because the amounts that they're talking about are relatively kind of low levels. So I think we saw that people were donating maybe between £1 and £3 on a weekly basis to these food banks. So actually, whether you believed kind of had negative or positive beliefs about how you perceived poverty and whether the government should step in and it's the government's responsibility to look after the poor, it didn't really matter, because I guess this mentality of every little helps. You might think, yes, it's the government's responsibility, but I can kind of buy a packet of pasta and just put it in that food bank and just perhaps make yourself feel a bit better about it. But interestingly, there wasn't really this. Perhaps if we're talking about kind of bigger amounts of money, people would have been more inclined to kind of think a bit more deeply about what they were going to be doing. But one of the things that we did look at was this idea of whose responsibility is it to look after the poor, and whether it's down to the poor person to kind of sort themselves out in some way, or the government. Yeah.
And and it's an interesting point you make there. Actually, if you expanded to look at monetary donations of increasing sizes to food banks, you suspect maybe there would become a point at which some people would say, actually, I'm not comfortable with that, because that becomes an endorsement of the kind of the structural
Yes,
context.
I think so. I think that's the point. It's relatively low amounts.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask as well, you sort of mentioned there about the context in the pandemic and the way in which people who weren't normal recipients of food banks might have become that, and whether that sort of changed behaviours. And one thing that struck me reading it was whether you had got any sense of the balance of views among people who were giving, between those who kind of were seeing it empathetically. So, their driver was, I could imagine that being me, and, that therefore I will give. And those for whom it was more about sort of pity for someone who they couldn't really empathize with, but, essentially they couldn't imagine being in such a terrible situation. Did you see those two different types of responses coming out?
There were those responses, but I think both of those, as you mentioned, were actually kind of two types of people were present in that group. Both types.
Yeah. So you can kind of have two quite different motivations or views of poverty, and they actually end up.
Yeah. So there were kind of varying motivations there. But definitely both of those sets of motivations would have been evident in the data.
And the one thing that I wanted to ask as well, there was one point in the paper where you noted that there were people who held relatively negative views of poverty as an individual failing, but still gave to food banks. And I wonder if there was any sense of, was that again because essentially it was just seen that it wasn't much of a big deal, so I might as well still do it? Or was there something else?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I think, I don't think we didn't have too much deeper insights, but I think we kind of concluded that it was just because of the kind of low monetary value, as you said.
Yeah, really interesting. I just want to sort of zoom out at this point, just kind of ask a bit. I think with both of these papers, it's kind of clear that there is relevance for practitioners in all sorts of ways, and lessons, and it's good to see them kind of as part of this ERNOP series. But I wondered what your experience was, or your perception of the kind of what the links are like between academia and practice around philanthropy and the voluntary sector at the moment. I mean, do you think that practitioners are aware of what's going on in academia and able to learn from it, and kind of vice versa? Do academics look to what's happening in practice, and are they able to draw from that?
Well, I think in general in academia, there's a big push, not just within the philanthropy sector, but there's a big push to work with practice, academics to work with practice, because, the government and the funding bodies do want to see impact, and whether the research that's being conducted is good value for money, it's good, whether it's good research for society. And I think within philanthropy specifically, I mean, I've always been interested in research that is practice driven. So I've always tried to kind of focus on research questions myself that I thought were worthwhile to help the charity sector. That's me personally. But I think organizations like ERNOP, like the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, ANOVA, I can see that definitely there's every time you go to a session or a conference, there's a big emphasis on trying to engage with practice, and more practitioners are coming to the conferences. And we've got initiatives like at the Journal of Philanthropy and Marketing, where I'm editor. We've got initiatives specifically looking at bridging this link between academia and practice. And one of my associate editors is really very good at kind of disseminating the key practical points that come out from the latest research on social media, where there's more and more practitioners kind of reading and engaging with that work.
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. And then the final thing I just wanted to ask, because I'm aware that often the research that we're talking about here, the research note is out now, but the actual work, as you say, for the food bank paper was done in 2019, so it's a little while ago. Just to hear a bit about what you're focusing on at the moment and what kind of areas of work you're most interested in right now.
Yeah, so actually, yes, it's really interesting. And one of the reasons why we've kind of put the typology disintermediation paper out so quickly, even though it's kind of work in progress, we could have worked on it for an extra couple of years, probably. Yeah. But, it's with this in mind that everything just takes so long to publish. And sometimes it's just better to put something out there, which is a good idea or work in progress, but it's kind of trending and interesting for people in practice. And then, if it's maybe problematic, or if there could be improvements to the work, that somebody else can pick up on it, work on it, or collaborate in partnership with the author. So I think it's really important to have things out, and maybe in kind of even in opinion format and things like that. At the moment, I'm actually kind of trying to apply the typology for disintermediation with a co-author, looking specifically at crowdfunding and looking specifically at what we described as type B1 disintermediation. So looking at the initiation of crowdfunding projects, because again, if you look at the literature, there's a lot of focus on which are the crowdfunding projects that work, which are the crowdfunding projects that people want to support, but we're looking at why people initiate crowdfunding projects. So I'm really interested in this idea of agency, control, why people think that they are better equipped to kind of start a campaign and then possibly donate that money to a specific charity of their choice, but not really actually engaging that particular charity in the fundraising process. So I kind of find that quite fascinating. And we are, again, kind of trying to, I guess, characterize people into whether they're kind of activists looking to crowdfund, or whether they're altruists, or whether they are somehow maybe believe that they're more effective in the way they and responsible in the way they manage or kind of acquire those funds. They, and we're looking into this idea of effective altruism as well, and whether people are kind of meddling with those kind of ideas. So it's really so that's what I'm focusing on at the moment.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating, and certainly something. I mean, I think that idea of supporter-driven fundraising that happens outside of the traditional institution, and what traditional charities' response to that is really interesting and topical. So I'll be really interested to hear more about that as the work progresses. Just remains to say thanks ever so much for coming on the podcast. Great to hear about the work, and wish you all the best with all of that future work.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to Pamala and to Arjen and to Ali and to Rita for giving up some of their time to talk to me. It's really interesting to hear about all of their work. I'll put links in the show notes to all of the research notes in question and also to the actual papers so that you can dig into those if you want to. If you're interested more broadly in issues around philanthropy and civil society, do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com, where you can find lots of articles, news updates about things that I've been doing, guest articles increasingly, and all the back episodes of this podcast, including all of the previous 3 partnership episodes we've done with ERNOP, so you can hear about more research there if you like. If you want slightly shorter, more bite-sized updates, do check me out on social media. I'm mostly on LinkedIn these days as my main thing. I'm barely on Twitter or X anymore because I find it so depressing, but I am just about still there. I'm also still trying to experiment with various other things like Mastodon and Threads and Blue Sky. So if you have any particular desire to make those work and want to kind of enlist me as a partner in crime, please feel free. If you like the podcast and you want to say something nice about it, please do leave us a nice review on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts, which probably isn't iTunes these days. And other than that, just in real life, tell all your friends about it. If you know somebody, a colleague or someone else that you think might be interested, please do recommend the podcast to them because word of mouth certainly goes a long way. And if you've got ideas for things we could talk about on the podcast or people I could talk to, please do feel free to drop me an email. My contact details are on the Why Philanthropy Matters website, and actually I've had some great episodes come about that way. Other than that, just like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!